Sometimes the biggest mistake of your life is the one that finally puts you where you were meant to be. The elevator dings softly as Emily Hayes steps out onto the 32nd floor, her heels clicking just a little too fast against the polished marble, echoing louder than she wants them to, like the building itself is judging her for being here, for not quite belonging. She glances down at the printed email on her phone again. Suite 320B, she whispers under her breath, like it might steady her nerves, like saying it out loud will make it real, because this interview, this one, is supposed to be different. Her last shot after months of rejection emails and polite smiles that never turned into offers. After sleeping on a borrowed couch that never quite felt like home. After watching her bank account drop below a number she doesn't even want to say out loud. She smooths down her thrift store blazer, fingers brushing over a faint ink stain she couldn't quite wash out, then tightens her grip on the worn leather folder pressed against her chest, the edges soft from years of being carried. Inside it, a sketchbook filled with ideas she never got to build, ideas that once meant everything. The hallway is quiet, too quiet, lined with glass walls and minimalist decor that feels expensive without trying. And for a second she hesitates, wondering if she's already out of place, but then she sees it. 320B, etched in clean silver letters beside a wide, partially open door. Voices drift out, low and serious. But she doesn't think much of it. Interviews happen in conference rooms all the time, right? She exhales, forces a small smile onto her face, and pushes the door open. The room falls silent. Not awkward silence, sharp silence. The kind that cuts. Emily freezes mid-step, her breath catching as her eyes adjust, and suddenly she's not looking at one interviewer across a desk. She's looking at a long table filled with people in tailored suits, at least a dozen of them, laptops open, eyes turning toward her one by one. At the head of the table sits a man, early 30s, dark suit, perfectly still, his gaze steady and unreadable as it lands on her like he's already assessing everything she is and everything she isn't. Emily's heart slams against her ribs, too loud, too fast, but she forces herself to speak anyway, because walking out now would mean giving up, and she's done too much of that already. Hi. I'm Emily Hayes, she says, her voice just slightly breathless, holding up her folder like proof she belongs here. I'm here for the interview. A few people exchange glances, subtle but unmistakable, and for a split second she realizes something is off. Something is very off. But before she can retreat, before she can apologize and disappear, the man at the head of the table leans back slightly in his chair, his expression shifting just enough to show interest, not confusion, not irritation. Interest. He studies her like she's something unexpected, something unscheduled, something worth not interrupting. The room waits, suspended in that quiet tension, and Emily stands there, alone, exposed, completely unaware that she has just walked into the wrong room, and directly into the most important moment of her life. Emily feels the silence stretch just a second too long, long enough for doubt to creep in, long enough for her instincts to scream that she should apologize and leave, but something inside her refuses to move. Maybe pride, maybe desperation, maybe the quiet voice that has kept her going through every rejection that said, just stay one more second. She straightens her shoulders slightly, forcing her grip on the folder to relax even though her fingers are still tense, and takes a step forward into the room as if this is exactly where she is supposed to be. The man at the head of the table tilts his head just slightly, watching her with a calm intensity that does not feel hostile. It feels curious, and that alone gives her enough courage to keep going. I know I am a little early, she adds, trying to fill the silence, her voice steadier now. But I brought my portfolio if you would like to take a look. And she places the worn folder carefully on the table in front of her like it is something fragile, something important, something that represents everything she has not been able to say in all the interviews that came before this one. A few people shift in their seats. One of them glances down at a tablet. Another leans back slightly, as if unsure whether to interrupt, but no one does, because the man at the head of the table has not looked away from her. He finally speaks, his voice low, controlled, and unexpectedly calm. Go ahead, he says, gesturing lightly toward the center of the table. Show us what you have. And the words land differently than she expected, not like permission from an interviewer, but like a challenge. like an invitation into something bigger than a simple job. Emily hesitates for half a heartbeat, then opens the folder, flipping it toward them, revealing page after page of hand-drawn concepts, branding ideas, interface sketches, all layered with notes in the margins written late at night, when she could not sleep, when she was trying to build something out of nothing. I do not just design things to look good, she says, her voice gaining strength as she speaks about the one thing she actually understands. I design them to feel right, to make people stay, to make them trust what they are looking at. And as she talks, she forgets for a moment that she is standing in the wrong room, forgets that her shoes are slightly worn, forgets that her blazer does not quite fit the way it should, because this part is real. The man leans forward slightly now, his fingers resting together, his expression unreadable but focused, and for the first time since she walked in, Emily notices something else, the way everyone else in the room seems to subtly watch him before reacting, as if his opinion sets the tone for everything that happens here. She pushes the thought aside and continues, flipping to another page. This one was for a small startup that never got funding, she explains, but the idea was to build community before profit, to make people feel like they belong before asking them to buy anything. And her voice softens just a little on that last part, because she knows what it feels like not to belong. There is a brief pause, the kind that usually means rejection is coming, the kind she has heard too many times before, but instead of dismissing her, the man asks another question, simple, direct. And if you had the resources now, he says, what would you build first? And something about the way he asks it, not hypothetical, not dismissive, makes her heart skip, because no one has ever asked her that like they actually expected an answer. Emily inhales slowly, steadying herself, and for the first time since she stepped into the room, she stops trying to impress them and just tells the truth. I would build something that people actually need, she says quietly, meeting his gaze without realizing it. Not what investors think will sell, not what trends say is popular, something that solves a real problem for real people. And the room goes still again, but this time it feels different, not sharp, not cold, but heavy, like something just shifted in a way no one expected, least of all her. Emily can feel every pair of eyes still on her, but something has shifted inside her, something quieter than confidence but stronger than fear, and she holds on to it as the silence stretches just a second longer. The man at the head of the table studies her like he is measuring not just her words, but the space between them. Like he is trying to understand how someone who clearly does not belong in this room is standing here speaking like she has nothing left to lose. One of the executives clears his throat softly, leaning forward with a polite but controlled tone. Miss Hayes, is it? He says, glancing briefly at her folder, as if searching for confirmation that is not there. This meeting is actually a strategic review, not a scheduled interview. And there it is, the moment she has been dreading, the confirmation that she has made a mistake, a very real one, and for a split second her stomach drops. Her fingers tighten around the edge of the table, and the urge to apologize and walk out hits her all at once. She nods slowly, her voice softer now, but still steady. I see that now, she admits, glancing down at the sketches spread out in front of them, suddenly aware of how out of place they must look among the sleek laptops and financial reports. I am sorry, I must have read the room number wrong. And she reaches forward, beginning to gather her papers, already preparing herself for the familiar ending, the polite dismissal, the quiet walk back to the elevator where she will replay every second in her head. But before she can close the folder, the man's voice cuts through again, calm but firm. Leave it, he says, not loud, not aggressive, just certain, and she pauses, her hands hovering over the pages. He leans forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. You said you would build something people actually need. He continues, his tone thoughtful now, almost probing. So tell me, what problem do you think we are solving wrong? And the question lands differently than anything before, not theoretical, not safe, but direct, almost dangerous in a room like this. Emily hesitates, her eyes flicking briefly around the table, seeing the subtle tension in the shoulders of the others, the way some of them sit a little straighter, as if bracing for what she might say, and she realizes this is not just a conversation anymore. This is a test she was never meant to take. She swallows, her pulse quickening again, but instead of retreating, She exhales slowly and answers, "You are solving for scale before trust," she says, the words coming out clearer than she expected. "You are trying to grow faster than people can believe in what you are building." And a faint ripple moves through the room, almost imperceptible but real, like a shift in air pressure. One of the executives leans back, another taps a pen lightly against the table, and for the first time Emily senses resistance, not to her presence, but to her idea. The man at the head of the table does not react immediately, and that silence, that deliberate pause, makes her continue. "If people do not feel connected to what you offer," she adds, her voice gaining strength again, "they will leave the second something cheaper or faster shows up, because there is nothing holding them there." And now she is no longer thinking about the mistake, no longer thinking about the wrong room, because this feels too real, too important to stop halfway. The man's eyes narrow just slightly, not in anger, but in focus, like she has just said something that matters more than anyone else expected. And then, almost casually, he asks, "And how would you fix that?" And Emily blinks, caught off guard again, because this is not what usually happens after you admit you are in the wrong place. This is not how mistakes are supposed to unfold. And yet here she is, still standing, still being asked, still being heard. She takes a breath, glances down at her sketchbook, then back up at him, and answers honestly. "I would start smaller," she says, "build something that earns trust first, even if it takes longer, even if it does not look impressive on a report right away." And the room falls quiet again. But this time it is not uncertainty. It is something heavier, something that feels like the beginning of a decision she does not yet understand. And as she stands there, in the wrong room, in front of people she was never meant to meet, Emily begins to realize that leaving might not be as simple as walking out the door anymore. The air in the room feels heavier now, like every word Emily has said is still hanging between them, waiting to be either dismissed or taken seriously, and she can feel it in the way no one interrupts, in the way even the quiet hum of the building seems to fade into the background. The man at the head of the table shifts slightly in his chair, not breaking eye contact, and there is something different in his expression now, not just curiosity but calculation, as if he is already testing how far her thinking can go. "Slower growth," he repeats, almost to himself, then looks at her again. "Investors do not like slower." And the statement is simple, but the way he says it carries weight, like it is not just a fact but a challenge. Emily nods once, because she knows that part is true. She has heard it before, seen it before, watched ideas get reshaped into something safer, something faster, something less meaningful. And for a moment she wonders if she should soften her answer, make it more acceptable, more aligned with what they expect to hear. But that same quiet voice inside her speaks again, the one that got her through the door in the first place. "Then maybe you are pitching to the wrong kind of investor," she says, the words leaving her mouth before she can overthink them. And the reaction is immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but visible, a subtle tightening of shoulders, a glance exchanged between two people on the right side of the table, a pen that stops tapping mid-motion. She feels it, the tension, the line she has just crossed, and for a second her heart stumbles, but she does not take the words back. The man watches her closely, his gaze sharpening, not offended, not amused, just focused, and that is somehow more intimidating than either. "Explain that," he says, leaning forward slightly, elbows resting on the table now, fully engaged. Emily exhales slowly, grounding herself, and gestures lightly toward her sketchbook. "If your product depends on people trusting it," she says, "then the value is not just in what it does. It is in how it makes people feel about using it. And that kind of value does not show up in numbers right away." She pauses, searching for the right words, but it shows up later, in loyalty, in retention, in people choosing you even when there are cheaper options. And as she speaks, she notices something she did not expect, a few heads nodding slightly, almost unconsciously, like they recognize the truth in what she is saying even if they are not ready to admit it out loud. One of the executives finally leans in, his tone measured but skeptical. "And how exactly would you measure something like that?" he asks, clearly testing her. Now, and Emily does not hesitate this time. "You do not measure it first," she replies, her voice calm but firm. "You build for it first, then you measure what comes back." And the room goes quiet again. But this silence feels different from before, not sharp, not uncertain, but weighted, like something has just been placed on the table that cannot be easily dismissed. The man at the head of the table lets the silence sit for a moment, then slowly sits back, his expression unreadable again, and for a brief second, Emily wonders if she has finally gone too far, if this is the moment everything ends. But then he glances down at her sketchbook, still open in front of him, and reaches out, flipping to another page without asking, studying it with a level of attention that feels almost personal. "You built all of this on your own," he says, not really a question, and Emily nods, her voice quieter now. "Yes," she answers, "just ideas, nothing launched." And there is a flicker of something in his eyes at that, something that looks almost like recognition. He closes the sketchbook gently, resting his hand on top of it for a second before looking back up at her. And when he speaks again, his tone is no longer testing. It is deciding. "Stay," he says simply, and the word lands with more weight than anything else that has been said in the room. Emily blinks, caught off guard, unsure if she heard him correctly, but no one else questions it, no one interrupts, because whatever authority he carries here, it is absolute. And for the first time since she walked in, she realizes that this mistake is no longer just hers. It has become something else entirely, something that is pulling her deeper into a room she was never meant to enter, and somehow, she is no longer being asked to leave. Emily does not move at first because the word feels too simple for what just happened, too small to carry the weight of everything that led to it. And yet no one in the room questions it, no one challenges it, because the man who said it has already shifted the direction of the entire meeting without raising his voice. She slowly lowers herself into the nearest empty chair, her movements careful, almost cautious, like she is afraid that if she moves too quickly the moment will disappear, and as she sits, she becomes aware of how different everything feels now, how the room that once felt intimidating now feels focused, like it is narrowed around a single point, and somehow that point is her. The man glances briefly at the others, a silent signal that the meeting is continuing, and just like that, the conversation resumes, but it is no longer the same conversation it was before she walked in. If we consider her approach, one of the executives says, his tone measured, no longer dismissive, "We would need to rethink the timeline entirely," and another responds, "and the allocation of resources." And Emily listens, trying to keep up, trying to understand how her words have shifted something this big, something she was never meant to be part of. The man at the head of the table leans back slightly, his attention divided between the discussion and her, as if he is watching how she reacts to everything unfolding around her. And after a moment he turns to her again. "Emily," he says, using her name for the first time, and it catches her off guard in a way she cannot explain. "If we gave you a small team and a limited budget," he continues, "what would you build in the first 90 days? And the question lands like a door opening, unexpected and impossible to ignore. Emily blinks, her mind racing, because this is no longer hypothetical. This is no longer just about ideas in a sketchbook. This is real. And for a second fear creeps in again, the fear of not being enough, of being exposed, of proving that she does not belong here after all. But then she looks down at her hands, at the faint traces of ink still on her fingers, and remembers the nights she spent building those ideas when no one was watching, when no one was asking questions, when it was just her and the belief that something better could exist. She looks back up, meeting his gaze again, and answers honestly. "I would not start with the product," she says, her voice steady despite everything. "I would start with the people who are supposed to use it." And a few heads tilt slightly, listening more closely now. "I would talk to them, understand what they actually struggle with, what frustrates them, what they wish existed but cannot find." She continues, her words gaining momentum. "And then I would build the simplest version of that solution, not perfect, not scalable, just something real enough to test if it matters." And the room quiets again, but this time it feels like agreement building rather than tension. The man watches her without interruption, his expression thoughtful, almost distant for a moment, like he is seeing something beyond the room, beyond the meeting, something that connects her words to a larger vision. "And if it fails," he asks after a beat, his tone softer now, but no less direct, and Emily does not hesitate. "Then we learn why," she says, "and we fix it, or we change it, or we let it go and build something better, but at least we would know we tried to solve the right problem. And as the words settle into the room, something shifts again, something quieter but deeper, like a foundation being tested and found stronger than expected. The man nods once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, but it carries weight. And then he turns to the rest of the table. Rework the proposal, he says simply, based on this direction. And there is no argument, no hesitation, just immediate movement as people begin making notes, adjusting plans, recalculating timelines, and Emily sits there, barely breathing, watching as a room full of executives starts to move around an idea that came from her, from a mistake, from a moment that should never have happened. And for the first time in a long time, she feels something she almost forgot how to recognize. Not relief, not luck, but the quiet, undeniable feeling that maybe, just maybe, she is exactly where she is supposed to be. The room does not return to what it was before. It evolves, shifting from a rigid structure of presentations and approvals into something more fluid, more alive, and Emily feels it in the way conversations begin to orbit around her earlier words, in the way executives who once barely acknowledged her now reference her ideas without hesitation. She sits still for a moment longer, absorbing it, then slowly leans forward, drawn back into the discussion not as an outsider anymore, but as someone whose voice has already changed the direction of things. Numbers appear on screens, projections are adjusted, timelines are questioned, and through it all, the man at the head of the table watches, occasionally asking a question that cuts straight through the noise, guiding without controlling, and every now and then, his gaze returns to Emily, as if measuring not just what she says, but how she holds herself in a space like this. After several minutes, the meeting begins to settle into a new rhythm, one built around possibility rather than certainty, and he finally closes his notebook with a soft, deliberate motion that signals something more final than any spoken word. That is enough for today, he says calmly, and the room responds instantly. Chairs shifting, laptops closing, quiet conversations beginning to rise again as people gather their things. But Emily remains seated for a second longer, unsure if she should leave, unsure if this moment is over or just beginning. She starts to gather her sketchbook, her movements slower now, more thoughtful, as if the pages inside carry a different weight than they did before. And just as she stands, his voice reaches her again, closer this time, no longer carrying across the room but directed only at her. Emily, he says, and when she turns, she realizes he is already standing beside her, the distance between them smaller now, the formality of the table gone. Up close, there is something about him that feels even more controlled, not cold, but deliberate, like every word he chooses matters. Walk with me, he adds, and it is not a request, but it is not an order either, something in between that she cannot quite define, and without fully thinking it through, she nods. They move out of the conference room together, the door closing softly behind them, cutting off the low murmur of voices, and suddenly the hallway feels quieter than before, the tension replaced by something else, something more personal. For a few steps, neither of them speaks, their footsteps echoing lightly against the polished floor, and Emily becomes aware again of everything she had forgotten while inside. The worn edges of her shoes, the slight crease in her blazer, the reality of who she is compared to where she is standing. She almost expects him to point out the mistake now, to finally say that she was never meant to be there, that it was all a misunderstanding, but instead, he stops near a large window overlooking the city, sunlight filtering through the glass and casting soft reflections across the floor. He turns to face her, his expression thoughtful, almost unreadable again, but there is a subtle shift in his tone when he speaks, less formal, more direct. You were not scheduled for that meeting, he says, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact, and Emily exhales quietly, a small nod acknowledging what they both already know. No, she replies, her voice calm. I was not. And for a brief second she braces herself, expecting the moment to end right there, expecting everything to collapse back into the reality she understands. But instead, he studies her for another second, then says something she does not expect at all. Good. And the word lands softly, but it changes everything again, because It means that what just happened was not a mistake to him, not something to correct, but something worth continuing. And as Emily stands there, looking at him, she realizes that whatever this is, whatever path she has just stepped onto, it is not leading her back to where she came from. Emily feels the word linger between them, simple and quiet, yet carrying a weight she cannot ignore. And for a moment she does not know how to respond because nothing about this day has followed the rules she understands. She lets out a small breath she did not realize she was holding and gives a faint, almost uncertain smile. Good, she repeats softly, as if testing the meaning of it, and he nods once, as though confirming something already decided. For a second neither of them speaks. The city stretching behind him through the glass, distant traffic moving like a silent current below, and Emily becomes aware again of how quickly everything has shifted, how she walked into this building hoping for a single opportunity and somehow ended up in a conversation she was never meant to have. "Do you always speak like that in interviews?" he asks after a moment, his tone neutral but edged with something that feels like curiosity rather than judgment. And Emily hesitates, a small laugh, escaping before she can stop it. "No," she admits honestly. "Usually I try to say what I think people want to hear." She pauses, glancing briefly down at her hands. It just never seems to work, and when she looks back up, there is a quiet openness in her expression, the kind that comes from having nothing left to hide. He studies her for a second longer, as if weighing that answer, then shifts his stance slightly, one hand resting casually against the window frame. "It does not," he says simply, and something about the certainty in his voice makes her realize he is not just talking about interviews. He looks back out at the city for a brief moment before continuing. "Most people spend years learning how to sound right," he says. "Very few ever learn how to be right." And the distinction settles into the space between them in a way that feels more personal than professional. Emily feels a small shift inside her again, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet recognition that he sees something in her that she has not been able to prove to anyone else. She nods slowly, unsure of what else to say, and for the first time since this began, she allows herself to ask a question. "What happens now?" she says, her voice steady but softer, because this is the part she cannot predict, the part that matters most. He turns back to her, his expression composed, but there is a subtle change in his eyes, something more direct, more intentional. "Now," he says, "we decide if that room changes because of you, or if it resets the moment you walk out." And the words land heavier than anything before, not as pressure, but as truth, because she understands immediately what he means. She glances back toward the closed conference room door, imagining the conversation still unfolding inside, the plans already beginning to shift, and she feels the weight of that possibility settle over her. The idea that something she said could matter beyond this moment. "I did not mean to change anything," she says quietly, almost to herself, and he lets out the faintest hint of a smile, not dismissive, not amused, just knowing. "That is usually when it happens," he replies. The silence that follows is different now, not uncertain, not tense, but filled with something that feels like choice. And Emily realizes that for the first time in a long time, the next step is not being decided for her, it is being offered to her. She takes a slow breath, steadying herself again, and meets his gaze. "Then I do not want it to reset," she says, the words simple but firm, and as soon as she says them, she feels something settle into place inside her, something that feels like commitment rather than hope. He nods once, as if that was the answer he was waiting for, and without another word, he turns toward the conference room, reaching for the door handle, pausing just long enough to glance back at her. "Then do not hold back this time," he says, and the moment hangs there for a second before he opens the door. The sound of voices rising again as the room comes back into view, and Emily steps forward with him. No longer just the girl who walked into the wrong place, but someone who has chosen to stay in it. The door opens, and the room shifts again, conversations softening just enough to notice their return, and Emily steps inside with a different kind of awareness now, not the hesitation she carried before, but a quiet resolve that settles into her posture, into the way she holds her sketchbook, into the way she meets the eyes that turn toward her again. The man walks back to his seat at the head of the table as if nothing unusual has happened, but the subtle change in the room says otherwise. The way people pause, the way attention recalibrates, and when he sits, he does not reintroduce her, does not explain, he simply gestures toward the table. Continue, he says, and this time when Emily moves forward, it is not tentative, it is intentional. She places her sketchbook back down, flipping to a page she had almost overlooked earlier, one filled with rough diagrams, arrows connecting ideas, handwritten notes that were never meant to be seen by anyone else, and she takes a breath before speaking. If we are serious about rebuilding trust, she says, her voice steady but stronger now, then we cannot treat users like data points. We have to treat them like participants. And the words land differently this time, not as an interruption, but as a continuation, like she belongs in the flow of the conversation. One of the executives leans forward, his expression more engaged than before. What does that look like in practice? He asks, and instead of hesitating, Emily answers. Immediately. It means involving them early, letting them see the process, not just the final product, she explains, gesturing lightly to her sketches. It means transparency, feedback loops, small iterations that actually respond to what people say instead of what we assume. And as she speaks, the energy in the room shifts again, not dramatically, but steadily, like a direction being reinforced rather than discovered. Another voice joins in. That would require a complete restructuring of the rollout strategy. And Emily nods, meeting the challenge directly. Yes, but it would also reduce long-term churn, because people stay with what they feel connected to. And there is a pause, a real one this time. Not uncertain, not skeptical, but thoughtful, like the idea is settling into place. The man at the head of the table watches all of this without interrupting, his attention moving between the discussion and Emily. And when he finally speaks, his voice cuts cleanly through the room. What would you call it? He asks. And for a second Emily is confused. The approach, he clarifies, his gaze steady. If you were building this as its own initiative, and she blinks, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question, but also by the implication behind it, because this is no longer about a suggestion, this is about something real. She glances down at her sketchbook, at the messy lines and overlapping ideas, and then back up. Open loop, she says, the name forming almost instinctively. Because it never closes on the user, it keeps listening. And the words settle into the room with a quiet clarity, and for the first time, a few people actually nod without hesitation. One of the executives begins typing quickly, another turns slightly to speak to a colleague, already discussing how it could be integrated, and Emily watches it happen, not from the outside anymore, but from within it. The man leans back slightly, his expression unreadable again, but there is a subtle shift in the way he looks at her now, something less like evaluation and more like recognition, and he gives a small, almost imperceptible nod before turning to the rest of the table. Build the framework around that, he says, and just like that, the idea becomes direction, the conversation becomes action. And Emily stands there, feeling the weight of it settle into something real, something undeniable, because this is no longer about being in the wrong room. This is about changing what happens inside it. And as she looks around, she realizes that no one is questioning her presence anymore. They are building around it. The momentum in the room does not slow down. It builds, spreading from one conversation to another, from one idea to the next, until what started as a single suggestion becomes a direction everyone is moving toward. And Emily stands there, still holding her sketchbook, watching it unfold with a kind of quiet disbelief she cannot quite shake. The phrase open loop appears on screens now, typed quickly into documents, circled in notes, repeated in low conversations, and each time she hears it, it feels more real, less like something she said and more like something that belongs here. The man at the head of the table remains composed, guiding the discussion with minimal words, but every time he redirects the focus, it aligns with what she introduced, reinforcing it without ever needing to explain why. After several more minutes, he finally closes the meeting with the same calm authority he began it. We move forward with this, he says, and that is enough. No vote, no hesitation, just acceptance. And one by one the executives gather their things and file out, some giving Emily a brief nod, others offering a quiet look of acknowledgement that did not exist before. The room empties until it is just the two of them again, the energy settling into a softer silence. and Emily lets out a breath she has been holding for what feels like hours. Her shoulders relaxing just slightly as the reality of what just happened begins to settle in. She looks down at her sketchbook, running her fingers along the edges of the pages as if grounding herself, then glances up at him, unsure how to bridge the gap between what just happened and what comes next. He stands from his seat, walking around the table with an ease that feels natural in a space like this, and stops a few feet from her, close enough that his presence feels more personal than before. "You did not just walk into the wrong room," he says, his tone steady, measured. "You changed what happens in it." And the words land with a quiet certainty that makes her chest tighten in a way she did not expect. She shakes her head slightly, a small, almost reflexive gesture. "I just said what I thought," she replies, her voice softer now, more honest. "I did not think it would matter." And for a moment she expects him to correct her, to explain the business reasoning behind everything that just happened. But instead he studies her for a second, then says something simpler. "It mattered because it was real." And there is no embellishment in his voice, no attempt to make it sound bigger than it is, just truth. Emily looks at him, really looks this time, and realizes that this is the first moment she has allowed herself to see him not as the man at the head of the table, not as the person everyone waits on, but as someone who chose to listen when no one else would have. "What happens to me now?" she asks quietly, not with fear, but with a kind of cautious hope she has not felt in a long time. He does not answer immediately, letting the question sit for a moment as if it deserves more than a quick response. Then he gestures lightly toward her sketchbook. "That depends," he says. "Do you want to keep this as ideas, or do you want to build it?" And the question lands deeper than any offer could, because it is not just about a job, it is about a choice, about stepping into something she has only imagined until now. Emily looks down at the pages again, at the lines she drew late at night, at the notes she wrote when no one was asking, and she feels that same quiet certainty rise again, the same one that kept her standing in that room when everything told her to leave. She lifts her gaze back to him, her voice steady, clear. "I want to build it." And as soon as she says it, something shifts, something final and undeniable. He nods once, a small motion that carries more meaning than any contract.